In the marble corridors of Renaissance Florence, where power shifted like shadows at dusk, Niccolò Machiavelli observed a fundamental truth that would echo through centuries: those who carry themselves as if they are destined to lead inevitably find themselves surrounded by followers. This principle, woven through the fabric of human nature itself, operates not through mere arrogance or blind ambition, but through the sophisticated understanding that perception shapes reality, and that the strongest fortress a person can build is the unshakable belief in their own supremacy. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Piazza della Signoria as Lorenzo de' Medici emerged from the Palazzo Vecchio, his bearing unmistakably regal despite holding no formal crown. Every step he took was measured, deliberate, as if the very stones beneath his feet existed solely to support his passage. The merchants who had gathered in the square that day found themselves unconsciously straightening their postures, their voices dropping to respectful murmurs as he passed. This was not the result of fear or formal authority, but something far more potent: the magnetic pull of a man who had convinced himself so thoroughly of his own excellence that others had no choice but to accept his valuation. Machiavelli, watching from the shadows of the Loggia dei Lanzi, understood that what he witnessed was not mere theater but the fundamental mechanics of human dominance. Lorenzo had achieved something that most men spend their entire lives pursuing: he had convinced not only others but himself that he was extraordinary. This self-conviction radiated from him like heat from a forge, warming those who came near and bending them to his will without the need for threats or bribes. It was power in its purest form, born not from external validation but from an internal certainty so complete that it left no room for doubt. The secret, Machiavelli realized as he observed the interplay between Lorenzo and his informal court, lay in understanding that human beings are fundamentally creatures of hierarchy. We instinctively seek leaders to follow, strong figures to whom we can attach our own ambitions and fears. When someone presents themselves with absolute conviction as that leader, when they assume the mantle of superiority with such natural grace that questioning it seems almost absurd, people respond by falling into formation around them. It is not conscious submission but rather an unconscious recognition of a natural order that feels right and proper. This principle operates across all spheres of human interaction, from the merchant's stall to the general's tent. In the workshops of Leonardo da Vinci, apprentices gathered around the master not because he demanded their attention but because he carried himself with such assured expertise that proximity to him felt like privilege. When Leonardo examined a canvas or manipulated a mechanism, his confidence was so absolute that those watching found themselves accepting his judgments before he even spoke them. His assumption of mastery created a reality in which mastery became undeniable. The same dynamic played out in the military campaigns that shaped the Italian peninsula. Commanders who approached battle with unshakable confidence in victory often found their certainty becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy. Their soldiers, sensing their leader's absolute belief in success, fought with the kind of desperate courage that comes from following someone who seems incapable of failure. Conversely, generals who harbored private doubts about their strategies often saw those doubts manifest in the hesitation of their troops and the eventual collapse of their campaigns. What distinguished these natural leaders from mere pretenders was not the absence of genuine skill or wisdom, but rather their ability to internalize their own superiority so completely that it became indistinguishable from truth. They did not simply act confident, they were confident, down to their very bones. This confidence was not built on empty boasting or superficial posturing but on a fundamental reimagining of their own nature and place in the world. They had convinced themselves, through careful cultivation of their self-image, that they were indeed the exceptional beings they appeared to be. The cultivation of this supreme confidence requires more than mere positive thinking or wishful self-regard. It demands a systematic reconstruction of one's internal narrative, a careful editing of personal history to emphasize victories while reframing defeats as learning experiences or temporary setbacks. Those who master this art begin to see themselves as protagonists in an epic tale where their ultimate triumph is not merely possible but inevitable. This is not delusion but rather a sophisticated form of psychological engineering, the conscious creation of a self-image so powerful that it becomes reality. Lorenzo de' Medici did not stumble into his position of informal authority through accident of birth alone. While his family name certainly opened doors, his ability to command respect and obedience from equals and inferiors alike stemmed from his meticulous construction of personal mythology. He studied the great leaders of antiquity, not to copy their strategies but to understand how they had convinced themselves and others of their own greatness. He practiced the subtle arts of presence and bearing until they became second nature, until the performance of superiority merged seamlessly with genuine self-belief. The merchants in the piazza that morning did not consciously decide to defer to Lorenzo, they simply found themselves doing so because his presence created a gravitational field of authority that pulled them into orbit around him. This was the fruit of years spent cultivating an unassailable sense of his own worth, years of telling himself and allowing others to tell him that he was exceptional, until the distinction between narrative and reality disappeared entirely. This phenomenon extends beyond individual psychology into the realm of collective behavior. When someone projects supreme confidence in their own abilities and judgment, they create what social theorists would later call a reality distortion field, a zone of influence where their version of truth becomes the accepted truth, where their priorities become everyone's priorities, and where their vision of the future becomes the only future worth pursuing. Steve Jobs would demonstrate this principle centuries later in the corporate boardrooms of Silicon Valley, but the underlying mechanics remained unchanged from Machiavelli's Renaissance observations. The assumption of superiority works because it satisfies a deep human need for clarity and direction. In a world full of uncertainty and competing claims to truth, the presence of someone who appears to know with absolute certainty what needs to be done provides enormous psychological relief. People gravitate toward such figures not out of weakness but out of a rational desire to align themselves with success, to bask in the reflected glory of someone who seems destined for greatness. However, this principle comes with profound responsibilities and dangers. The person who assumes supremacy must be prepared to deliver on the promises implicit in their bearing. The confidence that draws others must be backed by genuine competence, or the entire edifice will eventually collapse under the weight of accumulated failures. Lorenzo de' Medici maintained his position not only through force of personality but through actual achievements in diplomacy, economics, and cultural patronage. His assumed greatness was validated by demonstrable greatness, creating a virtuous cycle that reinforced both his self-image and others' perception of him. The danger lies in mistaking the performance for the reality, in believing that confidence alone is sufficient without the underlying substance to support it. History is littered with would-be leaders who mastered the external trappings of authority while neglecting the internal work necessary to justify that authority. They learned to project confidence without developing competence, to demand respect without earning it, and their inevitable falls served as cautionary tales about the difference between authentic leadership and mere pretense. True mastery of this principle requires what Machiavelli would have recognized as a balance between the lion and the fox, the lion's bold assumption of rightful dominance combined with the fox's careful attention to the realities that sustain that dominance. The most effective practitioners understand that their supreme confidence must rest on a foundation of genuine capability, that their assumption of superiority must be constantly validated through superior performance. As the sun reached its zenith over Florence that day, Lorenzo de' Medici completed his circuit of the piazza and disappeared back into the shadows of the palace. The merchants and citizens who had witnessed his passage found themselves carrying a different energy, as if some of his confidence had transferred to them through proximity. This was the ultimate test of true leadership, not merely commanding obedience but elevating others through the force of one's own self-belief, creating a rising tide that lifts all boats while maintaining one's position at the helm. The principle that Machiavelli observed that day would prove timeless precisely because it tapped into fundamental aspects of human psychology that remain unchanged across cultures and centuries. When someone assumes they are the best with sufficient conviction and supporting evidence, others do indeed fall in line, not as slaves or sycophants, but as willing participants in a vision of excellence that they too wish to inhabit. The crucible of self-destruction and rebirth, the second principle that Machiavelli understood with crystalline clarity, was perhaps even more radical than the first, that the greatest threat to any person's ultimate success comes not from external enemies but from the weak, compromised, fearful version of themselves that they carry within. This internal adversary, with its whispered doubts and paralyzing fears, its tendency toward comfort and compromise, represents the true battlefield where destinies are decided. The man who can destroy this weak self, who can systematically eliminate every trace of mediocrity and limitation from his character, becomes virtually invincible to external attack because he has already conquered the only enemy with real power to destroy him. In the dim chambers beneath the Palazzo Medici, where Lorenzo de' Medici conducted his most private affairs, a different kind of education was taking place. Here, away from the public displays of confidence and authority, the future master of Florence engaged in what he privately called the war against myself. Each morning before dawn, while the city still slept, he would descend to these chambers and conduct a merciless inventory of his thoughts, emotions, and reactions from the previous day. Every moment of doubt, every flash of fear, every impulse toward comfort or compromise was noted, examined, and systematically eliminated. This practice had begun years earlier when Lorenzo first understood that his greatest enemy was not any rival family or foreign power but the voice in his own head that whispered of limitations and impossibilities. That voice, which he came to recognize as the residue of every small humiliation and setback he had ever experienced, had the power to sabotage his grandest plans in ways that no external enemy ever could. It could make him hesitate at crucial moments, second-guess important decisions, or retreat from necessary confrontations. It was, he realized, the source of all weakness, and therefore had to be destroyed without mercy. The process of self-destruction and reconstruction that Lorenzo pioneered would later be echoed by military leaders, spiritual masters, and revolutionary thinkers throughout history, but few would pursue it with such systematic thoroughness. He began by identifying every limitation he had unconsciously accepted about himself, every boundary he had learned to respect out of habit or social conditioning. These artificial constraints, he understood, were like invisible chains that kept him operating at a fraction of his true potential. The weak self thrived on these limitations, using them as comfortable excuses for mediocrity. One by one, Lorenzo began deliberately violating these self-imposed boundaries. If he had always been uncomfortable speaking before large crowds, he sought out opportunities to address assemblies of hundreds. If he had inherited a cautious approach to financial risk from his family's merchant background, he began making bold investments that terrified his advisors. If he had traditionally deferred to older, more experienced men in matters of statecraft, he started asserting his own vision with unwavering conviction. Each violation of his previous limitations was like striking a blow against his weak self, demonstrating that the boundaries he had accepted were largely illusory. The physical manifestation of this internal war was equally important. Lorenzo understood that the weak self expressed itself through body language, posture, and physical habits that communicated uncertainty or submission. He spent hours before polished bronze mirrors, studying every aspect of his physical presentation and ruthlessly correcting any gesture or expression that suggested anything less than absolute authority. His walk became more deliberate, his voice deeper and more resonant, his gaze more direct and unflinching. These were not merely superficial changes but retraining exercises for his nervous system, teaching his body to express the supremacy that his mind was claiming. The emotional dimension of this reconstruction proved even more challenging. The weak self was deeply invested in emotional responses that served its need for safety and approval, the desire to be liked, the fear of criticism, the tendency to seek comfort in familiar surroundings and relationships. Lorenzo began systematically training himself to feel differently about these stimuli. Instead of seeking approval, he cultivated indifference to others' opinions. Instead of avoiding criticism, he began to view it as valuable intelligence about his enemy's fears and limitations. Instead of gravitating toward comfort, he deliberately sought out challenging, uncomfortable situations where he could test and strengthen his new character. This process required what modern psychologists would recognize as a form of cognitive restructuring, but Lorenzo approached it with the intensity of a military campaign. He recruited trusted advisors whose sole responsibility was to monitor his behavior and alert him whenever they detected traces of his former weak self emerging. He established elaborate systems of self-monitoring and self-correction, turning the development of supreme confidence into a science rather than an accident. The results were remarkable not only in their thoroughness but in their durability. Unlike someone who merely adopts confident behaviors without changing their underlying self-concept, Lorenzo had actually transformed his fundamental identity. He no longer needed to remind himself to act confidently because he had become confidence personified. The weak self that had once whispered doubts and fears had been so thoroughly destroyed that it could no longer influence his decisions or reactions. This transformation had profound effects on his relationships and interactions with others. People began to sense that they were dealing with someone fundamentally different from ordinary mortals, someone who seemed to operate from an entirely different set of assumptions about what was possible. His presence began to inspire a kind of awe that went beyond mere respect or admiration. Here was a man who had apparently transcended the normal human limitations of doubt and fear, who moved through the world as if he owned it by divine right. The principle at work here extends far beyond individual psychology into the realm of strategic advantage. When someone has truly destroyed their weak self, they become capable of actions and decisions that their competitors literally cannot imagine. They can take risks that seem insane to conventional thinking but are actually carefully calculated based on their expanded sense of possibility. They can maintain perfect composure under pressures that would break ordinary people, not because they feel no stress but because they have trained themselves to thrive on it. More importantly, this internal transformation makes them immune to many of the psychological weapons that enemies typically employ. Threats lose their power over someone who has already conquered their own fear. Attempts at humiliation bounce off someone who has already destroyed their ego-driven need for external validation. Bribes become meaningless to someone who has learned to find satisfaction in the pursuit of excellence rather than comfort. In essence, they become unstoppable not because they are invulnerable to attack but because they have already survived and conquered the most devastating attack possible, the systematic destruction of everything weak within themselves. The process that Lorenzo pioneered requires what can only be described as a form of internal revolution, a complete overthrow of the existing psychological government and its replacement with a new order based on different principles entirely. This is not therapy or self-improvement but something closer to alchemy, the transmutation of base metal into gold, of ordinary human consciousness into something approaching divinity. However, this transformation comes with its own dangers and costs. The destruction of the weak self can sometimes eliminate valuable human qualities along with the limitations, empathy, humility, the ability to form genuine emotional connections with others. Lorenzo was aware of these risks and worked carefully to preserve the aspects of his humanity that served his larger purposes while eliminating only those that constrained his effectiveness. He remained capable of love, loyalty, and genuine care for others, but these emotions no longer had the power to compromise his judgment or deflect him from necessary actions. The man who emerges from this crucible of self-destruction and reconstruction is indeed difficult to destroy through external means because the sources of his strength are internal and, therefore, largely beyond the reach of enemies. His confidence cannot be shaken because it is not dependent on external validation. His resolve cannot be broken because it springs from self-knowledge rather than circumstances. His effectiveness cannot be diminished because it flows from character rather than position or resources. This principle explains why certain figures throughout history seem to possess an almost supernatural resilience in the face of overwhelming opposition. They have learned the secret that Machiavelli observed in Lorenzo, that true invincibility comes not from building stronger defenses against external threats but from eliminating the internal weaknesses that give those threats their power. They have made themselves into fortresses with no gates for enemies to storm, no walls for siege engines to breach, because the architecture of their strength is psychological rather than physical. As Lorenzo emerged from his morning session in the underground chambers, the weak man who had descended hours earlier was, in a very real sense, dead. In his place stood someone harder, clearer, more focused, someone who had been refined in the fire of self-examination until only the strongest elements remained. This daily ritual of destruction and reconstruction ensured that he would never again be vulnerable to the kind of internal sabotage that destroys most people's dreams before their enemies even have a chance to act. The transformation was so complete that those who had known Lorenzo before his metamorphosis sometimes failed to recognize essential aspects of his character. Where once there had been a young man struggling with doubt and uncertainty, now there was something approaching a force of nature, as implacable and inexorable as the changing of seasons. He had succeeded in making himself into what every great leader must ultimately become, not merely a person who acts with confidence, but confidence itself given human form and strategic intelligence. The synthesis of absolute mastery, the convergence of these two principles, the assumption of natural superiority and the systematic destruction of internal weakness, creates what Machiavelli understood to be the most potent form of power available to human beings. This synthesis transforms the practitioner into something that transcends ordinary categories of leadership or authority, creating what can only be described as a gravitational field of influence that operates on multiple levels simultaneously. When someone has both convinced themselves of their own supremacy and eliminated every trace of self-doubt or limitation that could contradict that conviction, they become capable of reshaping not only their own destiny but the destinies of everyone who enters their sphere of influence. In the twilight years of his life, Lorenzo de' Medici had evolved into something his younger self could never have imagined. Seated in his private study high above the Arno River, surrounded by the treasures of learning and art that his patronage had made possible, he reflected on the long journey from the uncertain young man he had once been to the undisputed master of Florence that he had become. The transformation had been so thorough that he sometimes had difficulty remembering what doubt had felt like, what it meant to question his own judgment or hesitate before making a decision that would affect thousands of lives. The morning rituals of self-examination and reconstruction had long since become unnecessary, not because he had grown complacent but because the new self he had created had become completely stable and self-reinforcing. Every success validated his supreme confidence, while every setback served merely as raw material for further refinement of his approach. He had reached what military strategists would recognize as a state of dynamic equilibrium, where his power generated the resources necessary to maintain and expand itself indefinitely. This state of absolute mastery manifested itself in ways that went far beyond mere political or economic dominance. Lorenzo had discovered that when someone achieves complete internal alignment between their self-image and their capabilities, they begin to operate according to principles that seem almost magical to outside observers. Opportunities appeared where others saw only obstacles. Allies materialized from unlikely quarters. Resources flowed toward his projects as if drawn by an invisible force. What looked like exceptional luck was actually the natural result of someone moving through the world with such clarity of purpose and certainty of success that reality itself seemed to bend in accommodation. The key to this transformation lay in understanding that confidence and competence, rather than being separate qualities, are actually aspects of a single phenomenon. The assumption of superiority compels the development of genuine superiority, while the systematic elimination of weakness creates space for the growth of authentic strength. The two processes feed on each other, creating an upward spiral of development that has no natural stopping point except the limitations of human potential itself. Lorenzo's daily interactions with artists, scholars, merchants, and diplomats had become masterclasses in the exercise of this synthesized power. When Michelangelo brought him rough sketches of proposed sculptures, Lorenzo did not merely approve or disapprove but engaged with the artist's vision at such a fundamental level that the resulting works reflected as much of Lorenzo's aesthetic sense as the sculptor's technical skill. This was not the heavy-handed interference of an ignorant patron but the collaborative guidance of someone whose confidence in his own judgment had been so thoroughly validated by results that artists actively sought his input as a way of elevating their own work. The same dynamic operated in his political negotiations with other Italian city-states. Foreign ambassadors who arrived in Florence expecting to encounter just another wealthy merchant prince instead found themselves dealing with someone who seemed to understand their positions better than they understood them themselves. Lorenzo's combination of assumed authority and genuine insight allowed him to restructure negotiations in ways that left everyone feeling they had achieved their objectives while ensuring that Florence's interests were served above all others. This synthesis of internal mastery and external influence created what modern theorists would recognize as a form of soft power that was actually more compelling than traditional forms of coercion. People followed Lorenzo not because they had to but because proximity to him offered them the opportunity to participate in something larger and more significant than their individual concerns. His projects became their projects, his vision became their vision, not through manipulation or deception but through the natural human tendency to align with superior force when that force is expressed through intelligence and competence rather than mere brutality. The economic effects of this mastery were equally remarkable. Under Lorenzo's guidance, Florence had become not just prosperous but the center of cultural and intellectual innovation for the entire known world. The city's banking operations extended across Europe and into the emerging markets of the East, while its workshops produced art and luxury goods that defined taste for the wealthy throughout Christendom. This was not the result of natural resources or geographical advantages but of one man's ability to imagine possibilities that others could not see and to inspire the collective effort necessary to transform those possibilities into reality. The educational dimension of Lorenzo's influence proved equally transformative. Young men from across Europe sought opportunities to serve in his household, not for the material benefits but for the chance to observe mastery in action. They understood intuitively that they were witnessing something rare and valuable, a living demonstration of what human beings could become when they refused to accept conventional limitations on their potential. These protégés carried Lorenzo's approach to power and self-development back to their home cities, creating ripple effects that would shape European culture for generations. However, the most profound aspect of this synthesis was its effect on Lorenzo's relationship with mortality itself. Having destroyed the weak self that feared death and clung to comfort, he had achieved a kind of practical immortality that went beyond mere longevity. His influence was so deeply embedded in the institutions and culture of Florence, his approach to excellence so thoroughly demonstrated through tangible achievements, that his death would represent merely a transition rather than an ending. The principles he embodied would continue to operate through the people and systems he had shaped, ensuring that his mastery would outlive his physical presence. This transcendence of ordinary human limitations created its own set of responsibilities and challenges. Lorenzo understood that his example would be studied and emulated by future generations, that his successes and failures would become part of the permanent record of human possibility. This knowledge added weight to every decision and elevated every action from mere personal choice to historical statement. The man who achieves absolute mastery becomes, in a very real sense, a teacher for all humanity, demonstrating through his life what dedication and intelligence can accomplish when freed from the constraints of conventional thinking. The isolation that sometimes accompanies such mastery was offset by the deep satisfaction of living according to principles that had been tested and validated through consistent application. Lorenzo had become proof of concept for the thesis that human beings need not accept the limitations that circumstance and convention attempt to impose upon them. Every aspect of his life served as evidence that superiority is not an accident of birth but an achievement of will and wisdom systematically applied over time. As evening descended over Florence and the last light reflected off the dome of the cathedral that his grandfather had helped to build, Lorenzo understood that he had achieved something that most people never even attempt: the complete realization of his own potential. The weak, uncertain young man who had once doubted his ability to live up to his family's legacy had been so thoroughly transformed that he now served as the standard by which future generations would measure their own achievements. The synthesis of assumed superiority and destroyed weakness had created something unprecedented in his experience: a human being who functioned as a force of nature, whose very existence expanded the realm of possibility for everyone who encountered him. This was the ultimate fruit of Machiavellian wisdom, not the cynical manipulation that bears his name in popular culture, but the sophisticated understanding that power, properly developed and exercised, becomes indistinguishable from virtue, and that mastery, once achieved, creates conditions that benefit not only the master but everyone within his sphere of influence. The sun set over the Tuscan hills as Lorenzo de' Medici completed another day in a life that had become itself a work of art, a demonstration of what human beings could accomplish when they combined ruthless self-development with unwavering commitment to excellence. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, but he would meet them as he had learned to meet everything, with the absolute confidence of someone who had already conquered the only enemy that truly mattered, and with the accumulated wisdom of someone who had spent decades proving that extraordinary achievement is available to anyone willing to pay the price in sustained effort and systematic self-improvement. The principles that Machiavelli observed and Lorenzo embodied would outlive both men, becoming part of the permanent toolkit available to anyone bold enough to assume their rightful place among the masters of their age. The assumption of superiority, combined with the systematic destruction of internal weakness, remains as relevant and powerful today as it was in the marble halls of Renaissance Florence, waiting for those with sufficient vision and courage to claim the mastery that is their birthright as thinking, willing human beings capable of unlimited self-transformation.